So we are running really an incredible conference coming up on women trauma and mental health. And Ebony, you and I are really going to be co-hosting some critical
We
conversations.
are. Yes, yes, yes. And well needed conversations at that.
So, for those of you who don't know, obviously Dr. Ebony Webb is a psychologist. As a director of PESI UK, I'm also a clinician. So,
Hmm.
we thought what we would do is just really, bring in some thoughts and ideas around. I don't know about you, Ebony, but I've been with my clients, we've had a kidnap, a rape,
Hmm.
a murder here of Sarah Everard
Hmm.
that has been coming into our clinics. And I don't know what's happening on your side of the world, but certainly, women in our society are feeling actually really unsafe.
Yes. And, I would say that in here in the States, we've had different movements, including the Me Too movement, even the perception of safety with our various political leaders, where I have received text messages from my female clients asking, is it safe? Is it safe to go out? It's stirring up my own trauma story. And so I think that this is a common and very sad bridge of trauma that is spanning the globe.
And I think, it's incredible because obviously these events have been happening, and it's not the first time,
Nope.
that we are seeing this really almost like a epidemic of violence towards women kind of
Yes.
resurfacing yet again.
Yes.
And in some ways in the UK by authority figures. And we have this we have this women's conference coming up.
Mhm.
I think it's the 18th, 19th of November that we are co hosting. And I think, I don't know about your thoughts, Ebony, but, as therapists, we kind of, we work below the headlines.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And and to your point though, what I think is so important is this isn't new. And in fact, historically, right? We're talking centuries, eons, women have been oppressed and the subject of oppression, right? And of course, we can talk about every, human being and sentient being on this planet having some experience of oppression. And, right, we are going to be hosting this discussion about the impact of women in terms of trauma and mental health. And yes, below the headlines, and that's where we work, and we've known that these things are going on. Right? When it surfaces to the headlines and becomes, I guess, valid and legitimate, that is also another wound for women who have been, suffering and crying out without being heard, right? And I definitely think the intersection of social media has brought these pieces to the surface, right? Often, as you and I, have discussed and talked through here in the States, say with the case of Sandra Bland, a part of that was because of what she recorded on her phone. Right. And so there's so many pieces where victims have to record themselves if they're lucky to get justice. And unfortunately, often justice after the grave, right? And so it's an important discussion because we as clinicians are hearing those stories of those who are invisible, those who don't have the power, and we're trying to heal those wounds that continue to perpetuate generation to generation.
Hmm. And I think, Ebony, you raise such it's a critical point. It's not just a
Hmm.
point, it's an absolute point that it's kind of what I heard you say is that what does it have to get to?
Hmm.
What needs to happen for example, does someone have to be murdered in a very violent way
Mhm.
for it to make the headlines, for it to get attention, for something to happen so that people start waking up
Mhm.
about these kind of issues and women's place in society? Like,
Mhm.
where do we, like, why does it always have to go this way?
Yeah.
Why aren't greater things being done in the here and now, that it has to
Mhm.
get to the point where some horrific tragedy has to happen, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Africa, Asia, Australia, before we kind of start seeing, things starting to take shape?
Yeah, and I think that is often been the historical pattern, right? People have to render their pound of flesh in order for it to become real, right? And I remember having sat at this table with an indigenous woman in Minneapolis who talked about that there was such a need for people to recognize that when we tell our stories, women of color, what have you, that these are often untreated, festering wounds. And for her, her frustration was that I have to rip open that wound again and start bleeding for you to know that this is real. And when you finally know it's real, I still have to do the work of healing that wound all over again. And that I ask that you have the compassion when you inquire about my story, that you don't force me to reopen my wounds. So I think that's the piece here is that, right? How many times do persecuted groups have to open their wounds before they decide it's not worth it, right?
Mm,
And they suffer in silence, right? And, and then there can be the anger behind it that this only becomes legitimate when I open these wounds, right? Or someone has to die, right? And I think I understand the intention, but there were misguided communications. Um, say with some of the issues that have happened in my nation, where people will say, "Thank you for your sacrifice," and gratitude for a person who had to lay their life down in order for there to be validity. So, I think we're at a real critical point here. When do we decide, like you're saying, no more? Right? No more of, sacrificing people for this to become legitimate. And there is a difficulty, right? Because our attention spans have gotten very short. So my fear, even with the case that has just happened for you all here in London, is when does this become a soundbite? When does Sarah no longer become relevant for the next soundbite? Right. And that's the problem, is that we keep shifting and then it no longer becomes valid and the next fun thing, or in like, so that's the hard part here, you know
yeah, yeah. And you raise an interesting point, and I want to sort of add to that. And I know we've got an audience question coming in,
yes.
but one of the reasons why I decided to start this women's conference, which has now become the biggest women's conference in the world, talking about women, trauma, and mental health, is because when we look at some of the statistics, if we
Hmm.
look to trauma statistics, sort of like in terms of diagnosis, women have higher rates of PTSD, they
Hmm.
have higher rates of depression, they have
Hmm.
higher rates of anxiety. They have so many more diagnoses,
Hmm.
understandably, because of what we've really been talking about, place in society, not being heard, these burdens that have gone from this century, 200-300 years ago.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yet the rates of diagnosis are still creeping up.
Yes. Hmm. Yeah. And I think that this is the hard part, right? Because even those diagnostic categories have been used to marginalize women, right?
Exactly.
Women who were suffering horrific amounts of abuse, right, are told that they are hysterical, right? And there's something wrong in their bodies that needs to be corrected, right? And so then that deepens the general distrust of our authority as healers to genuinely heal in their best interests, right? And so we are continuing to see those high rates because perhaps we still have not captured what is the essence of healing. And maybe it goes beyond the diagnostic category. The categories are important, but also does it soften our lens of compassion or just put victims into a box that we can control? And so
Mm.
I think those are the important discussions that we have to address at this conference. And I think we will in terms of new ways of being. Um, and I think the very nature of this conference, right, um, is I think one of the solutions because historically these categories, these discussions of what's happening to women have been led by men. There have been many men at these tables talking about the problems of women. And so I'm excited to be a part of and share a table with deep thought leaders that are women of color because that is, I mean, I think it's always interesting, isn't it? Let's talk about the problem of women. Let's talk about the problem of people of color, but there are none of those people at the table to talk about those problems. Okay.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
I think that's an important part of this, discussion of how do we reduce ongoing harm? How do we decrease these rates? I think it's really having women talk about this from the inside out.
Yeah. And so, I guess that, just really calling all women, whether you are a clinician or you're really interested, or in some way you or a family or a friend has been affected by trauma or mental health, to really get involved in this conference that is
Yes.
coming up.
Yes.
Because as Ebony says, we've really kind of got to work from almost the inside out
Hmm.
to bring ourselves to the table, and
Yes.
to continue to bring ourselves to the table every time.
Hmm.
And this is a fantastic opportunity, really, to get that kind of global gathering of women getting very interested in trauma and mental health. And I think what's just most important is really standing up to make that change about what is happening in our society and what will happen moving forward.
Yes. Yeah. And, there are, we won't, we will not heal unless we really name those pieces that have wounded us, right?
Mm.
I've said, we will either heal or repeat. I mean, and that's something that I've learned from some of the women who are coming to this conference. Under their training, we either heal or repeat, and that has been consistent in history. Um, and women need to lead these conversations. But not only that, I feel what's very important to understand is how hard it is to stand in this sense that we are worthy to live, right?
Yeah.
Because throughout various periods, the way that women have been perceived is not on equal par, you know, and so, I do DBT, and DBT has a tagline of building a life worth living. Well, with trauma, we're going to talk about that intersection at this conference. With trauma, you've got to work with the client to sense that they are worthy to live,
Yeah.
right? And when you hear stories and cases like what just happened in London, what has happened, right? That this person, this woman is not worthy to live her life walking home. Um, and I mean, I'm sorry, but a violation is not a death sentence. That does not
Yeah.
equal a death sentence unless the person who is enacting that violence does not see you worthy of life. And
Mm.
so we have to restore that, right? And I hope that we can, provide tools, and I believe we will, that instills that sense of the worthiness to live, right? Which I think is different than just building a life worth living, you have to know that you are worthy to live. And that
Yeah,
has not always been historically conveyed to women.
correct,
Hmm.
correct. I want to continue chatting, Ebony, and kind
Sure.
of pick up on this part. I'm aware that an audience question has come in, and
Yes.
let's just see if we can. Here we go. So I'll read that out from Libby. Libby, thanks so much for posing this
Yes. Thank
question
you,
to
Libby.
us. Is there an assessment tool that is able to be used in therapy to better identify situations, red flags, or of abuse against women? Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, Ebony, do you want to start off? Do you want me to start off? What do we, how do we?
Well, I definitely love using the ACEs um, assessment tool, the adverse childhood experiences, because so much of the abuses against women begin even before they come into our office, and often very early on that have been swept under the rug. So when I start walking through that survey, many women initially like, well, I didn't come from all this abuse, blah 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 blah. But as we ask the questions, right, then there's another awareness. Well, yeah, this did happen, right?
Yeah,
And it creates a
that's right.
dialogue of awareness, right? That perhaps because people already have like extreme notions of abuse and trauma, right? And but they don't look at these kind of nuanced factors
Yeah,
that lead to ongoing traumatic experiences. So I absolutely love that as a way to start a dialogue to help them expand their understanding of what abuse and trauma can look like.
yeah.
How about for
And
you?
well, it's funny. I use the same sort of framework as a clinician when I've got
Mhm.
my clinical hat on. And one of the reasons why I do that is not because it's a great sort of assessment tool, but what it tells me is, as we were talking about that erosion to kind of a birthright of
Mhm.
being in the world as a woman,
Mhm.
what it tells me is, okay, let's have a look at maybe where there's been erosion to self-worth, self-esteem, kind of some of those vulnerabilities
Mhm.
that I then know how that may impact
Mhm.
current or future relationships with a particular client that I'm seeing. So
Yes.
that ACEs study for me, Ebony, like yourself, is almost like how can you say it, it lets me know what someone might be predisposed to,
Yes.
and kind of it can help me sort of form more of a robust clinical assessment as to
Mhm.
where we might go with whoever I'm working with.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so, just a really great question from Libby, and I think that's one of the things. Like, I set up this conference because I'm excited about women's future and
Mhm.
us being in the world in terms of our birthright, our power, our equality, the intersectionality, all that kind of thing, regardless of gender, race, etc. And
Yes.
I think this conference doesn't just call on clinicians, but what it also calls on is people really interested in mental health, trauma, and how it's affected women. So, and I say that because I think one of the things that we have the opportunity to do at a conference like this is really psychoeducate women who might not know about some of these nuances, about vulnerabilities, about
That's
red
right.
flags, about, oh, did I have trauma? Was that, oh my God, yes, it was trauma.
Mhm.
And how we can kind of help educate, just your normal woman on the street.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we recognize too with that, even just how, I mean, I was so fascinated by the origins of how we got the ACEs exam through basically like a weight loss program. And a part of it is that when you start naming things, it lands you in the body. And trauma in and of itself is this act of experiential avoidance, right? We cannot survive what's happening to us in the body. So we leave it, right? And so, when we start psychoed with clients, we have to be so gentle in that somatic reentry. Um, as the Galway Canal, poem talks about, St. Francis and the Sow, we have to reteach a thing its loveliness, right? And so much of
That's
that is
beautiful.
is it is a beautiful poem. It's one of
Oh,
my
wow.
favorite ones.
Mm.
And you know, this idea that in trauma we are reteaching women their loveliness, and that is a scary, scary venture, right? And it's a delicate dance where I want this healing and I'm scared of this healing. It overwhelms me, it floods me, right? And so having, these pathways of safety to land in the body, and so many of the women who are going to be presenting will be showing that way. That is so essential because so much of our traumas, especially as women, have been around the, fetishization, the traumatization of the female body. And we've come to either have a love-hate relationship or an outright hatred. And so as we heal the mind, we're healing the body of women. And as I love in that poem, right, reteaching her loveliness. And if you catch that poem, it's beautiful because it's talking about a pig, right? And finding the loveliness in the magnificence of this mother pig, and I think that's so much of our work, you know.
Mm. Hmm.
Yeah.
And you've really kind of hit, some of, a very sort of precious point because
Hmm.
I don't know about you. I've been watching. I don't know what's happening in US Netflix, but last night I was watching Gwyneth Paltrow's. I think it's Sex, Love, and Goop.
Yes. Yes. Hmm.
And they were talking about sort of number of therapists with the couples talking about sort of how shame impacts women
Yes.
and the self-esteem, the self-worth, or the lack of, or actually what used to be there, but as we have been talking about, has been eroded over time, whether it's been in this generation or throughout the generations.
Hmm.
And so, you really sort of sharing that poem and those words
Hmm.
is really about, helping women, and I think we'll do this through this conference,
Yes.
is that kind of birthright to feeling that life force that doesn't
Hmm.
have shame, that is not conditioned, that is not the socialization of the mothers or the fathers or the families or the societies, but
Hmm.
actually, allowing women's natural healing to come through so
That's
that
right.
can also impact future generations in terms of girls who will come through in 10, 20, 30, 40 years time to really feel their place in society.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting as you say that because yeah, if we continue to decimate and destroy and traumatize the female body, you are destroying future generations, right?
Absolutely.
You are destroying the opportunity for future generations. And um, I think we all have our television shows, and my husband happened to glance as I was watching there's a show, Why the Last Man, which is about this post-apocalyptic point where all men have died except for one man and a monkey, which I think is hilarious. But nothing but then there are all these now women. It's just nothing but women, right? And, it's very difficult and yet, right? Women having to figure out how to perpetuate a future generations, right? To continue now. And they can because of, various banks and everything. But as my husband was watching, he's like, yeah, I mean, as men, we would die out in a generation, right? Because we can't perpetuate life. And so it's like we're destroying, women are being destroyed, and we perpetuate future generations, you know and as trauma goes on, and I'm always so fascinated at the intersection of you know, generational trauma, trauma in marginalized communities, and the rates of infertility in those same communities, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so we've got to create this, stream of healing, both mentally and bodily, for women who have
Yeah.
suffered trauma, you know. And women have been vilified, right? For it's the mother's fault, it's all those things, right? And so we're in a wave with these thought leaders to change the mindset. And what I'm encouraged about in my work with young females, that they have a different mindset than even the mindset that I grew up in, right? There's a
Right.
strangeness to the isms that we have learned how to adapt to. They don't get racism in the same way, or sex. This is and it's unacceptable, right? And that's what you want to galvanize. That's what you want to capture, because when you can capture young people, you change the world. And that is also consistent historically, for better or for worse. You can change the world. And so, I think this is important for mothers and their children, right?
Yeah.
To understand this, to break patterns, and to promote healthier generations.
Yeah. And I guess we'll be going into sort of some of this on the conference. Last night I was actually teaching for a U.S. university,
Hmm.
and one of the things I was teaching on is that kind of neurobiological timeline between sort of what happens biochemically right now and that timeline that then changes genes over the our DNA over the decades.
Yes.
And just another aspect of why you know change, really going into these critical conversations around mental health, resilience, trauma with women is so important,
Hmm.
because epigenetically we change the epigenome over time through psychotherapy and various healing practices.
Yes.
And that's really important, Ebony, because what you were talking about is like, that timeline changing, grandmothers, mums, girls, etc.
Hmm.
Well, we have to change, because if we don't change, we get the epigenetic change in the wrong direction
That's right.
towards disease rather than towards well-being and healing.
That's right. It's all potential, and it unlocks or locks, right? And that's the heal or repeat, right? Down to the
Yeah.
genetic level. Science is absolutely supporting that it's either going to heal or it's going to repeat. And because we are creatures, wired for balance and homeostasis. And what happens when the homeostasis is trauma, right? It makes sense. You're adapted to survive, but what we're going for in healing is thriving, which is something totally different, totally different. And every generation can do just a little bit more. I just had this conversation this morning that the best that my grandmother did was to get my mother out of Mississippi, right?
Wow.
Out of that trauma. And that's as far as my mother, my grandmother could get. And she got my mom to the north so that then my mom could get me to where I needed to be, right?
Amazing.
Right. And so there's that piece of healing, right? Um, and that's what we want to continue to see. We want to have compassion and grace for the generations behind us, right? And to look at what does that empower us to do, which is not necessarily repeating again those trauma patterns, right? But healing and resting, right? And dreaming again, right? I think of trauma as a thief that steals wonder and curiosity and dreaming. And that's what we want to bring back to women, because that also gives a hopeful generation in the
Mm.
future.
That's beautiful what you just said. And I
Mhm.
think, I'd like to, well, carry on this conversation, but in
Yes,
some ways end it here, because I know
right.
you've got to head off. I've got to head off. And just before we do that, I really hope, if, who's ever been listening in to both Ebony and I, um, do join us for this Woman
Yes,
Trauma and Mental
please.
Health Conference. Bring your friends. If you're a clinician, if you're a lay person, it doesn't matter.
That's right.
Let's really start this global movement of really healing mental health and trauma, which impacts women. And if you're really interested, we've got Janina Fisher. I'll be chatting to Janina Fisher next Monday. Join us. I've forgotten the time, but we'll be putting it on our social feeds. So look forward to seeing you there. And we'll be talking all about and going more in depth about trauma and, how we really heal from that if you have been impacted by it.
That's right. It's going to be a
Ebony,
great time.
it is. It's so just great to jam and have some time with you. And
Yes.
I'm looking so forward to co hosting this really important conference together.
Yeah, me too. And it's, stay tuned, more to come. And this is just the beginning, right, of an ongoing dialogue. And that's what's so important. So, absolutely, I'd love to see as many people as possible, generational, all the intersections, because we all need to come to this table of discussion.
All right. See you guys next week.